He Simonda's there as well. You said to it is 4 o'clock now. Should we wait a little bit more? You said there's more people coming in, or should I get underway?
You can start, Prof. It's fine. They can
Okay.
join us later.
Okay. Right. I'm going to put on my presentation first. All right. I trust that you can all see the presentation. I said to I would introduce myself, and I think part of what I'll cover in the introduction is also going to be a bit of an introduction to me and the kind of work that I've done as well. I am within the Rhodes Business School, where I'm responsible for coordinating the research programs of the school. But I've also both taught and done research on research methods, as well as focusing on leadership and its development. So you will see those two ideas coming through a lot in the presentation today. And the topic that I've been asked to talk about is the deductive approach to qualitative research and procedures that I've been working with my students for them to follow when we've taken a deductive approach. So in the workshop this afternoon, I would welcome interaction with you. So if you have any questions, please feel free to put your hand up. Hopefully I'll see it. If I don't, and I'm moving on to something else, then rather just unmute and talk to me rather than us having to go back later on to that point. So in terms of the session today, I want to just start out with a bit of an introduction about the rationale for this particular method that I'll be talking to you today about, tell you a bit about some of the publications and then the approach that we'll be taking. And really, there's two key questions that we want to explore together today. The one is, when is it suitable to use this deductive approach to qualitative research? And I guess also going with that is, when is it not suitable? When is it not appropriate? And then what are the steps involved in carrying out deductive qualitative research? So with that in mind, if we move on to the introduction, firstly, let me give you a bit of a background to how this particular approach has developed and how I started to get to write about this approach. On the one hand, it was trying to develop a method for our MBA students in the business school. But in addition to that, it was related to my own research interest. So the research trajectory that I've been trying to develop is in the area of leadership and its development. And what I've found there is I've done mainly qualitative research, and this has largely been neglected in leadership studies. There's a very strong dominance of quantitative approach or approaches to leadership research. Many people either develop or use various research instruments in a questionnaire format, gather the data, and do various statistical analysis to look at the relationship between different leadership variables and other similar concepts or variables, especially from organizational behavior. So there's relatively less studies that have adopted a qualitative research. And when you look at that research, you'll find as well, a lot of it doesn't build on previous studies. And this is maybe partly the orientation of qualitative researchers. And I recognize some qualitative researchers simply do not want to maybe develop or contribute to theory and its development related to the areas they're doing research in. But those of us that are interested in that, when you look at what is being done there, there isn't really this accumulation of a body of knowledge. And it's often because people have their own unique point of departure and they go into that research study with their own views in mind, rather than really acknowledging the existing literature. And this already starts to highlight maybe some of the tensions between what I'll be talking about today as a deductive approach to qualitative research, where for many of those qualitative researchers, they are adopting an inductive approach to their research. And I'll talk about these terms in a bit more detail later on. But it's for that reason, partly, that there isn't this accumulation of knowledge. So I was trying to also find a way that there could be methods used that would advance the accumulation of a body of knowledge related to qualitative research in the area of leadership. I suspect as well there might be similar concerns in other areas of especially management-related literature. So this is the field I'm in, and maybe in other disciplines as well. But I think it certainly is something for you to think about as you consider whether to adopt this particular method or not, is to look at what is the current state of the body of knowledge in that area that you want to research, and therefore, is this an appropriate method or not to be able to advance that body of knowledge. So what I've done then from about 2019 onwards to about 2022, I've written a couple of journal articles and conference papers, and what I've been trying to do in that is twofold. On the one hand, to be able to have a research trajectory that is related to the teaching of research methods. And so a lot of the publications are also orientated to either novice researchers or students in their research, and giving them the methods, procedures, techniques to be able to undertake this research or this kind of research. And this is what I'm going to be summarizing, I guess, from these different studies or papers that I've done, this deductive approach to qualitative research. So there's a number of studies or papers I started to write to explain this particular method. And as I've then taken them to conference or been asked to extend it into a journal article for review and so on, other questions have arisen. And as students have started to use these papers, they also then had certain questions. And so that led to further papers. And so at the moment, there are this collection of 5 articles that I've written that have either gone to conferences or been published in journals. And it's related as well then to one of the conferences that I've been attending in the supporting journal, which is this European Conference on Research Methodology for Business and Management Studies, and the Electronic Journal of Business Research Methods that then supports that conference as well. And so many of these publications should be available in the public domain. The conference proceedings are published there, and the electronic journals available online as well to be able to access the full publications. If we then look at the approach to qualitative research that typically is positioned in, I think, many disciplines, and certainly where I started to encounter that initially was in the field of psychology. My background is in industrial and organization psychology, and certainly in psychological studies, there was this development of qualitative research that was recognized initially to be quite different to the dominant quantitative research at the time. And so initially we saw this distinction being made between quantitative and qualitative research approaches. That has been developed far more now, where there's this recognition of a whole range of different research paradigms or approaches, including positivist, post-positivist, interpretivist, constructivist, and others. And of course, some of the more postmodern approaches saying these approaches themselves are really constructs in themselves that need to be deconstructed. But I think for our purposes today, it's quite helpful to at least maybe try and simplify this and recognize there are these 2 main approaches to research. One that is to do with quantitative data and tends to be approached largely from a positivist or post-positivist research paradigm, and tends to be deductive in its orientation. And so what that means, and that's what's illustrated below, is that there's quite an extensive and quite comprehensive review of the literature and the theory. And based on that theory, there's then probably a set of propositions or hypotheses that are developed, and you then go and collect data and you see whether in the analysis of that data, whether you can confirm or your hypothesis or not. So that's tended to be the quantitative approach to research. It's not the only way of doing quantitative research, but that's what I've encountered in the management and leadership fields in particular. On the other hand, the qualitative research tends to adopt more of an interpretivist approach and goes into the field, often collects the data, and may or may not be interested in trying to generate theory or link what the findings are to theory. Some methods, such as the phenomenological method, might not even be wanting to look at theory, trying to get to the essence of experience, and in doing that, bracketing off theory, for example. But generally, these methods are inductive, meaning we're going into the field, we're collecting data there, and we are really doing an analysis of that data based on comparing one piece of data to another, rather than the theory informing our analysis. So these have been the two dominant approaches, and what I'm proposing, I guess, would look like this, where I'm saying, surely there's space for a qualitative approach that really starts as its point of departure with the literature, with the theory, from that identifies certain research propositions, and then goes into the field and collects the data and compares it to that theory. And so that is done, I'm going to explain further, very much from a positivist or post-positivist perspective, especially in leadership research, and also adopts then this deductive approach to thematic analysis, which I'm going to mainly focus on today. And that thematic analysis then is really a theory-driven approach as we look at a deductive approach, compared to thematic analysis under an inductive approach, which is a data-driven approach, where the data itself and comparing one piece of data to another helps you to develop your themes. This approach deductively is saying the theory is there, we have propositions from that, and we're using that to inform our analysis of the data. So just to remind you then, the two key questions we want to look at this afternoon are, firstly, so when is it actually suitable to use this deductive approach in qualitative research? And then secondly, just to explain to you the different steps that I propose are involved with carrying out such deductive qualitative research. And what I'll also do is give you some examples of various studies where these steps have been applied as well. So that first question is really, when is it suitable to do deductive qualitative research? And we find with all of the research that we do, we've got these various decision points to make, we've got different paths we have to choose. And so what is it that, as we get to this decision point, leads us to say, well, actually, it is appropriate for us to use deductive approaches in this qualitative study? And what I'd like to propose is 4 considerations, certainly 4 that I've identified. There might be others, but 4 reasons why this deductive approach might be worth using in your qualitative research. And they are, firstly, the nature of the phenomenon that you're investigating. Secondly, the level of maturity of the research concept itself that you're working with. Thirdly, it's about the kind of data that is available. So this starts to look at practical considerations. And then lastly, the nature of what you're researching. So if you are investigating process in your research, then I would suggest that this deductive qualitative approach could be appropriate there. So I'm going to explain each of those in a bit more detail now. So firstly, one of the reasons why you might use a deductive thematic approach is related to the nature of the phenomenon you're investigating. And I guess here it's also about saying that if the phenomenon you're looking at doesn't meet this set of requirements, it's probably not an appropriate method to use. And what I like to do at this point is just to draw an analogy or to use as a metaphor what happens in a court case. So hence the picture of the scales on the right there, the justice scales on the right-hand side. If you think about a court case and how it unfolds, what the judge is doing is being presented with various evidence, both from the defense and the prosecution, and in the end has to weigh up that evidence that is being presented and to come to some sort of judgment or conclusion. And I think for the qualitative researcher, there's a similar kind of process of investigation, but not with all phenomenon. So requirements are here that we are looking at something that has occurred that we can treat objectively, and therefore it's post-positivist research we are looking at here. It is stable. So in other words, it's not about people's perceptions or opinions that if I was to go back to them tomorrow, they would be able to maybe give me a different view, different perception, because their views have changed. So it's often then an occurrence of a series of events maybe that have unfolded, or some experience that people have observed, and it's their account of that experience. And that's why I like to draw that analogy to the court case, where there's some sort of crime maybe that's been committed. And so something actually has happened. What has happened? We're trying to establish the truth here, and we recognize that truth is stable. So it's not like the case can change. There's a series of events that have occurred. There's a crime that's been committed, and we're trying to prove what happened and who was guilty of that crime. And so in our research, there's a series of events that have occurred that people have had some experience of, and we maybe are then interviewing them, for example, or you might be making observations of events that are unfolding, and you're trying to record what actually happened and recognizing there's a single reality, there's a single version of the truth of what has unfolded. So those are important qualifications for looking at this particular method, and we're using this particular method. It's going to be for things that have actually occurred that we're then trying to investigate, and we recognize that single reality. And much like the judge then would be weighing up different evidence and trying to triangulate that evidence to present to see a stronger case for or against one of the parties, or trying to make an assessment of who's the better or more credible witness, or which is the better source of data to use. In the same way, you're gathering this data and you are trying to make an overall assessment of what actually happened, or to at least be able to describe or determine what actually happened, or to analyze a series of events that might have unfolded. The second reason for using this particular method is related to the level of maturity of the research concept you're looking at itself. In one of my papers, I make the comparison to servant leadership research, which is one of the topics that I've investigated as well. And if you look at the research on servant leadership, you'll find that it's developing quite quickly and is maturing as a concept quite strongly. There's also been a lot of interest from quantitative researchers, but there's also been interest over the years from qualitative researchers into this concept of servant leadership. And so as we then look at how particular concepts develop, we see there might be an initial concept that is introduced by someone. They might then explain that. So we might have books and certainly in the case of servant leadership, you can go back to the work of Greenleaf, and he started to advocate for this particular approach to leadership and wrote some books about that. Others then started to develop that further, to move into that second stage of concept evaluation and augmentation, where there's maybe an expansion and consolidation of certain ideas. that we then move into the third phase. And when we get into that third phase of concept consolidation and accommodation, we find that the study itself, or that concept itself and its related concepts, is quite mature, quite stable, investigated quite extensively, and often the quantitative researchers become quite dominant in that space. And we've really moved into a space of theory testing on the right-hand side. The qualitative researchers tend to be more interested in theory development or theory generation, if they're interested in theory at all. So from my perspective, how do we generate theory? Qualitative research needs to start that process, and we're going in sometimes into the field inductively to investigate what's going on and to systematically try and record that. And so we start to elaborate on an idea. And with those two positions in mind, then, what I argue is that as the concept starts to begin to mature, it's then appropriate to use deductive approaches to test that concept, or to test this emerging theory, the concept and other concepts it's linked to, in other words. And in testing it out, we also allow for new discoveries, new ideas that might be added to or augmented, in other words, added to our emerging theory. So this is why it's quite important then to have a good sense of this particular concept that you want to investigate. How well has it been investigated before? How many studies have been done? What types of questions have been asked? Are they more quantitative in nature already? There could be a qualitative angle that you can probe and still discover new things. Is there already a conceptual framework related to that particular concept or topic developing or not? And just to pick up on that idea of a conceptual framework is different to a concept map, where we can think of maybe mind mapping a concept and ideas related to it. A conceptual framework is really a picture that would show the linkage of different concepts to one another and how they're related to each other. If they are just simply related, if there's a causal link. If so, what is that chain of events or causal links in those concepts? And so typically, those conceptual frameworks become our theories and models that other studies might build upon. So one of the papers as well is related to the idea of conceptual frameworks. And again, further down, when I get to some examples, I'll illustrate these conceptual frameworks that I've used in some of the papers. So how well developed is the network of variables, if you like, to show how your key concept is linked to other concepts that people might be studying over the years. So in sum then, if we are saying a theory is starting to emerge, it's not yet fully established, it's not fully mature, but there's still room not only to test it, but to maybe expand upon it, to add more to it, then this approach is the right one to use for that kind of concept. The third consideration is maybe a more practical consideration. And in some of the examples I'll get to later on, we have in fact used quite well-established or mature theories or frameworks that we've applied in a qualitative way. And the reason for that is the practicalities of what kind of data is available. And I think this picture on the right of the Smarties starts to illustrate that. If you're looking at the Smartie box and all the Smarties in it, there's lots of the Smarties can represent different data points. There's a few data points that you've got there, but there's lots of different colors. There's lots of different ideas, variables, concepts that are also included in that box of Smarties. So in other words, what we're saying is we have these multiple points we want to collect data about, or multiple concepts or variables we want to get data about, but we can only really get that data from a small sample set. So if that's the case, it becomes quite hard to do meaningful statistical analyses simply because we can't get a large enough sample to be able to reach conclusions or really to test hypotheses. So instead, what we can do is take then this quite developed theories and apply them in a qualitative way, collecting data from a small sample set, but still being able to do meaningful research in this manner as well. Again, I will illustrate this idea when we look at some of the conceptual frameworks, and you will see the many concepts we sometimes are trying to link to one another, which would require a very large sample if we were doing statistical research, but for qualitative research, we can still do something quite meaningful from that. And then the fourth reason for using this method is if you are investigating process in research. And I've put up this definition from Demir and Lichnell just to illustrate what I mean by process. And if you think about many of the conceptual frameworks and models you might come across in articles that you read, if they are developed by quantitative researchers, the quantitative researchers look at those models as a set of variables that are connected to each other. And the variables might increase in their level. So we could measure something and there's either a high or low level of that. But what often happens from a qualitative research point of view is you are looking at a series of things linked to each other that are maybe different stages, different set of actions, different set of functions, different sets of operations that go from one step to the next to the next. One of my areas of research is to do with leadership of change. And if you look at the change process, we recognize individuals who have change imposed upon them would go through different stages of firstly denying the change and then getting angry when they realize it is going to happen and then want to bargain and then getting depressed because they can't do anything about it and eventually maybe coming to acceptance of that. Now, each of those stages is very different qualitatively in nature, not just quantitatively in nature. And I argue that that kind of process can only really be properly understood and investigated from a qualitative point of view. And that's the kind of idea that Demir and Lichnell are supporting as well. So if you've got a series of steps that are unfolding and you want to investigate that, and there's a qualitative in different nature of one step to the next, or the different concepts as you go through those steps, then this approach would be suitable. Okay, so I've tried to give you some background as to when to use this particular approach. I'm going to take you through the steps and give you some examples of that as well. But before I do that, I just want to stop sharing for a moment. I see there are some comments in the chat. I will be sharing the presentation, Simon. I will send it to the Center for Postgraduate Studies, and they can then distribute it to everyone that was registered for this session. And yes, that there also will be a recording available for that. I just want to pause at this point in the presentation, or the workshop, just to hear if there's any questions you've got about the first part of what I've covered so far. So that question about when is it suitable to use this method? Are there any questions you might have about that? Is there maybe particular research that you're wanting to do and you're wondering, is this the right method to use or not? Have you still got questions about that, or have you now got the answers based on what I've said already? I just want to pause for a moment. Please feel free to put your hand up and make a comment or ask a question about that. If there isn't any, then I'm going to move straight on to the next section. Okay, I don't see any hands going up. So I see people saying thank you, very clear. Thank you for that feedback, Penny. Appreciate that. And Simon as well. You say it's clear for you as well. So let me go back to my presentation. So I want to highlight the steps firstly, and then I'll be illustrating the steps after that. And then we have another chance afterwards just to take any questions that you might have or comments you might want to make about this process. So if we talk about deductive qualitative research overall, what I've tried to illustrate in explaining the approach is that it begins with the concepts and with the literature. So you begin with quite an extensive reviewing of the literature, and from that literature, you then develop your conceptual framework. And as I've explained, the conceptual framework is about a number of different concepts and their relationships or their linkages to one another. And as we think of that as the conceptual framework, each of those lines that join concepts to one another actually represents a research proposition. So we can then start to articulate what those research propositions are that we are interested in. Many times what we'll do, especially with masters and sometimes even with PhD studies, is once you've done that comprehensive review of the literature and we see quite a dense connection of various concepts to one another in this network or nomothetic network that quantitative researchers refer to, or this conceptual framework that I prefer to use as the phrase. We might say there's too much there for us to investigate, and from that theoretical framework, we then extract a conceptual framework for our own study of what we want to investigate. So we have our conceptual framework, we develop the research propositions. Once we've got that, we can then, before we even collect data, we can develop a coding frame and a memo based on our literature, in other words. And then we go into the field, we collect and we analyze the data. And I'll explain that in a bit more detail, firstly in these steps that we'll be going through, and then illustrating each of the steps as well. So as I said, step one is really coming from the literature review, where you then are really developing a conceptual framework for your study. Once you have that framework, you can then easily extract research propositions. I'll explain what a code book is and a coding memo and show you some examples from those. So you develop your code book, you develop your memo. If you're doing interviews, and this particular paper that I'm drawing from talks about using interviews, it's not the only way you can collect data, but very typically students of mine have been using interviews for data collection and sometimes complementing that with documentation. And so what becomes quite important in designing your interview is what questions you will ask. And so a question matrix can be used for that. I'll explain what a question matrix is shortly as well. So there's all that preparation that takes place up front, including figuring out what questions you'll ask in an interview, which typically is a semi-structured interview, but fairly structured as well to make sure you cover everything you need to. And then you've got your code book and coding memo that once you've got that data, once you've collected it, you can then analyze it using the codes in the code book and applying the coding memo and refining the coding memo as well. And I'll explain that shortly. And then there's your write-up and the reporting. So here's one example that I've used in my conference paper of a conceptual framework. And this is a conceptual framework that I illustrate in relation to personal change. And basically the particular approach or the theory that I've drawn from says, if we want to make a personal change, and an example here might be adopting a healthier lifestyle, there are three components that will contribute to that. There are certain triggers that trigger a person to make a personal change. There are certain motivational factors or reasons that will motivate someone to make that personal change. And then simplicity, or the less effort there is to have to make this change, the more likely I am to make a change. So we got these, if you think in quantitative terms, we would have certain independent variables of triggers, motivators, and simplicity, and we might be wanting to investigate to what extent those are contributing to personal changes that people actually make or not. And I could then design a quantitative study that measures these as variables, collects the data from a sample of people and that have gone through some sort of change, and they rate the level of success of making that change or not. And I can run various statistical analyses to see how each of these triggers, motivators, or simplicity factors contribute to the effectiveness of change, or the level of change. Or in other words, which of these variables, independent variables, contributes to explaining the change in the dependent variable or personal change. My interest is not in that. My interest is, as a qualitative researcher, going into the field and investigating particular triggers, particular motivators, particular aspects of simplicity, and seeing how people have utilized those or not in making certain personal changes, or are those relevant in the field or to the particular cases that I'll be investigating of personal change. So this is what step one would look like then, where in this one at a very high level, we've got these 4 different concepts of triggers, motivators, and simplicity, and their relationship to personal change. From that, we're then able to extract various propositions. And in fact, if you look in the paper, you'll see it becomes more complex or more detailed than just simply a trigger, a motivation, or a question of simplicity. And so the theory I draw on talks about a range of different types of triggers, talks about a range of kinds of motivation, and talks about a range of reasons for simplicity or ability to make the change. And you can see those in the brackets here. So at a high level, the proposition for triggers is about an individual is more likely to adapt or adopt a healthier lifestyle when there are triggers for the behavioral change. That's essentially, in words, what you saw in that picture. And those triggers are then what they refer to as sparks, facilitators, or signals. So just to illustrate that, there might be a particular spark where someone goes to the doctor and there's a medical examination done, the realization they need to change their lifestyle and adopt a healthier lifestyle because now they've been diagnosed, for example, with diabetes or whatever it might be. And so that becomes the spark. There might be certain signals that are alarm reminders to make sure the person gets up in the morning to go to gym, for example. And so they're making this healthy lifestyle change. Proposition 2 is about motivation. An individual is more likely to adopt a healthier lifestyle when motivated to do so. And what motivates them? Well, the theory says people are motivated by pleasure, hope, or acceptance, or the negatives of those. People are motivated by, I want to avoid pain, I'm scared of something happening if I don't change, or scared of rejection. And so you can see pleasure versus pain, hope versus fear, and acceptance versus rejection as almost a continuum of 3 motivations that are included in this theory. And then lastly, the proposition of ability or simplicity, saying an individual is more likely to adopt a healthier lifestyle when it is simple or easy to do so. So it requires, for example, little time, little money, little effort, and it's not about becoming unpopular when I do so. And in fact, it can fit in with my current routine already. So there's a whole lot of sub-dimensions then of ability or simplicity. So in a way, we've got 3 main propositions, but that can be further expanded into at least 3 trigger propositions, or proposition 1A, 1B, 1C, 3 or 6 motivational propositions, so 2A to C or 2A to F, And then similarly with ability, I think there's 5 there, 3A to E if I wanted to. But I'm just trying to, in this example, highlight how we go from the first step of, from the literature review, we have these different concepts that we are integrating, maybe extracting from a more dense conceptual or theoretical framework, and develop our own conceptual framework for our own study that we're doing. And this is about personal change for a healthier lifestyle. I then have these propositions, and so right up front, I know what I want to go into the field to collect data about. I want to test these propositions out, not statistically, but rather I want to see whether they apply in the data that I collect, in the site that I go into, in the case study that I investigate, whatever it might be. And so what I've illustrated here then is how upfront you could then create a code book. So this is just really abbreviations that you can use as you then code your data. And I'll talk about different ways of doing that. Some people might want to print out the whole transcription of, say, an interview and use the margin then to put in these kind of codes. Or there might be certain documents you're looking at, and as you read through them, you want to then put these codes in. You could do this manually, in other words, writing with your pen. You could do this kind of coding on a document digitally, so even in Word, to, for example, use the reviewer function. If you're using some sort of software like Atlas, Atlas AI, you could then also use these as your codes that you then build into Atlas and then code your data accordingly. But yeah, you simply have this list up front of these are the codes that I want to apply to my study. The code book then is accompanied by a coding manual. And here is an example of a section of a coding manual. And you'll see it's only a section because there are 3 rows here that refer to 3 particular concepts out of 5 that someone was looking at: personal role conflict, role strain, and role incompatibility. But the overall structure of this coding manual is correct, where we would, or is complete, in the sense that we would have a label for our code. We would have a definition for that code, which is coming from our literature review. So it's the formal definition we'll find in the literature. We then have a description of occurrence, which is really saying we had a formal definition. How do we operationalize that definition? What will it look like if I go into the field? How will I recognize this as I read through my data or as I conduct my interview and then analyze the data afterwards? How will I see something called personal role conflict? So that's the description of occurrence. And then I further expand on that with a set of qualifications or exclusions, where I can start to say, well, if it has this feature, then it does belong here. If it has this, it doesn't belong here. So we can have certain qualifications and exclusions. And I'll come back to this shortly, just to explain how that's developed once I show you the 5 ideas that this person was working with from role theory. So in this particular study, the person was looking at a change initiative in an organization. That initiative involved having people who were identified or volunteered to be change champions. So this is employees in that organization who have got other jobs to do. And in addition to that, they now have this additional role called a change champion, where they're trying to help with the change process. They're championing that change. And what the study is interested in is, where does conflict occur, typically between maybe the main role in the employee, or as an employee of the organization, and whatever job they have to do, versus being a change champion. Where does the conflict arise from, for example, the team involved with the change process itself versus their manager who wants them to do a certain job and get the work done? And so the literature on role conflict tells us there are typically these 5 kinds of conflict that people would experience: ambiguity, personal role conflict, role strain, role overload, and role incompatibility. And so this is one of the MBA studies that are supervised, and Koliswa then recognized from a literature review these were the 5 things she wanted to investigate as possible ways in which change champions might experience role conflict. And so, did they experience any of these forms of role conflict? And if so, how did they experience that? She could write up that account. And I've given the reference at the bottom of the slide there. And so, based on that, she now needs to be clear in her own mind what these different concepts are. So, the 5 types of conflict, what they are, how they're defined, how they will be seen when she goes into the field and collects the data and starts to analyze that data. And then what you'll find is the qualifications and exclusions help to clarify, as you look at a particular piece of data, which of the 5 types of conflict does it conform with, or what label, in other words, should I give to that piece of data? And so you have this prepared up front, but sometimes you'll find as you compare one incident or one event, in this case of conflict, with another, and you need to weigh up which of these 5 types of role conflict is it, you might then make a decision and recognize there's another criteria that you use to differentiate, to clarify, does it belong here or not? And so the qualification and exclusion criteria, while they are informed initially by the literature, they are also informed by the different codes that you're comparing with one another. And they might also be further refined as you go about your data analysis. So that last column, in a way, is dynamic. And we could also add another column where we just indicate the sources of where we got the definition from, for example. But these are the main columns that make up your coding manual. You have a preliminary one, and as you work with your data, the qualifications and exclusions might then be expanded or refined to help you, to guide you and anyone else looking at your data and its analysis in how you applied your coding list or your list of codes to the data that you collected, and the manual's helping you to do that. So just to illustrate 1 or 2 of the points. So person role conflict is about differing values, preferences, or maybe a lack of skills that someone might have that prevents them from meeting the role requirements. What does that look like when you go into the field, when you try and make sense of it, when you apply it to a change champion? It would mean change champion's own role, the expectations or values of that role, their own preferences, are in disagreement with those of one or more role senders. So role theory will talk about you, the target, you, the individual, in this case, the change champion, and there's other people who are then sending you different sets of expectations. And there's conflict that's caused between one or more of those role senders. As we then qualify what that means, there's qualifications and exclusions. We recognize, firstly, the person role conflict is about only one of those roles. So it's not about 2 different roles being in conflict. It's about one role that I must carry out. So, for example, it might be in being a change champion, there are different people, different role senders, who are sending me contradictory information, what I should do as a champion. Okay, that's where it belongs in terms of it's a type of person role conflict. So the qualification is related to a single role only, whereas if you look at the bottom row, role incompatibility has got to do with 2 roles, and those 2 roles are incompatible or conflicting with one another. And so as I look at a case, I would need to be analyzing it and saying, is this conflict about one or two roles that this change champion is telling me about? If it's about one, then it's more likely to be a person role conflict. If it's about two different roles, then it's an example of role incompatibility. And then that's why I have an exclusion under person role conflict. It's excluded if it's not related to differences between two role senders. Okay, so what I'm highlighting here is how the qualifications and exclusions, initially I can set those up based on my description of occurrence, but as I get a piece of data and I analyze it and I try and classify it, there might be other insights I get and further qualification or exclusion criteria that I determine. So essentially what we are going to use the manual for is to say the manual is linked to my list of codes or code book. So for each of these codes here, I would need to have some sort of explanation of what kind of change are we talking about here in terms of healthy lifestyle, what kind of trigger, what kind of motivation, what kind of ability or simplicity code is it, definitions for each of those, and description of occurrence for each of those, and inclusion or exclusion criteria for each. So I need to be quite clear in my own mind, when is something a trigger that's a spark or a trigger that's a signal? What is the difference? Am I clear on that? So as I read a piece of data, I know, do I give it the code of spark or signal, for example? So this is what you're preparing up front to do, but you do refine those qualification and exclusion criteria as you work with the data, if need be. Okay, so you're applying the coding manual to the data. And so what this means is you've then got a piece of qualitative data that has been labeled as, for example, person role conflict. There'll be other instances of person role conflict. You can then pull all of that together and look overall at what this data, what the participants had to say about their experience of person role conflict. And if you've used transcripts, you can then take from that certain quotes to illustrate as you summarize overall what everyone has said about person role conflict. And I guess that's getting me into the data analysis, which I'll come back to shortly. Still, before we get into the data collection, we need to plan, in this case, for an interview. And so this is back to my healthy lifestyle example. And what you see illustrated here is in the first column, the set of questions that are going to be asked in the interview. And essentially, what the matrix is doing is saying, if we add these columns of this question is a background question, here's proposition 1, 2, and 3. As I look at each of the questions, I can then determine whether I expect to get information from asking that question that either is just background, and some questions would be, but gives me maybe some information about proposition 1, 2, or 3. And so as I'm asking those questions, it helps me then to probe further because it's a semi-structured interview. But what it also allows me to do is, once I've prepared my set of interview questions like this, I can then be confident by just simply going down each of the columns, be confident to know that I've asked questions about every one of the research propositions. So this is the important thing about doing a deductive approach. I can't come out of the field and say, oh, I don't know the answer because I didn't ask the question. I don't know what the triggers are in this case because I didn't ask about triggers. I would need to have asked the questions. And they might have said there wasn't a trigger, then that's fine. I'd at least have asked the question, as opposed to, well, they didn't say anything about a trigger, so I can't really report on what that person had to say about triggers. So this is your planning documents. This is the first part of it. There's another section here where I then have maybe certain probing or follow-up questions to, for example, what has made it easy for you to change your behavior? That's the proposition 3 on ability or simplicity. And we then start to look at each of those subcomponents of time and money and physical or mental effort and other people, how they would respond, and what about your routine Did you have to make any changes to your routine and so on? So I probe each of what I described earlier as sub-propositions with those questions as well. So they might tell me about it already. If they don't, then I've got the set of questions about time. If they've said nothing about time, I make sure I follow up with a question about, so how much time does this require? So I can start to make that assessment about simplicity and personal change. Okay, so that's the question matrix. I then go into the field, I collect my data. Using qualitative methods, it could be observational data. More typically, it's either interviews, maybe focus groups, or it could be documentation that you're analyzing. And well, you're collecting. And as you analyze it afterwards, these then are the kind of steps that you're going to be going through. You'd first take out your code book and your memo, and you then go about labeling your data to apply the codes. Once you've applied the codes to the data, you're then able to sort and group the data as it's been coded. And then as you look at a particular code, you're then able to identify the patterns or themes and write up those summaries of what the different themes are. If you think about thematic analysis, we would often also start to pull different codes together to create a bigger theme, and sometimes there's different themes under a broader category. If you were doing, for example, a grounded theory study or other inductive thematic analyses, here there's probably going to be less of that grouping, simply because the grouping already has been predetermined by your conceptual framework and research propositions. But certainly once you've got all that data from the different interviews about a particular topic or code, you would then need to summarize what's being said there. And because we're trying to test out or verify whether this applies in that site, we often are then trying to look for, is there consensus here? Is there agreement here? Or is there disagreement here? Are there different views here? And so we would want to tease out those kind of distinctions as we look at the patterns and the themes. What I have included on the slide at the bottom here is a paper you could look at by Ose, who describes how to use Excel and Word to be able to conduct your qualitative analysis. So if you don't want to use Atlas, you could, for example, just use Excel and Word, and she takes you through step by step the process of really taking a code, coding the data, and then sorting it to identify particular patterns and themes, and then writing that up. What I will talk about a bit later on is how we start to consolidate everything that we have been analyzing here. So these different themes, these different research propositions, how does it all come together? And what we find is some qualitative studies would also be using more than one theory and comparing those theories to see which one best fits or best explains the data that we've collected. So I will talk about that, and that's the idea then of pattern matching and recording of hits and misses that we would do on the, as you see, that last step possibly of the analysis. Step 7 is reporting. And so overall, this would be the kind of structure for your findings chapter that you would have. There's typically in qualitative studies a need just to give some background to the case, to the incidents, to the events that you are looking at. And so the change champions, in that study, for example, we might need to describe the nature of this change and how it's unfolded and what it consisted of and who the champions work with and why they brought in champions and so on. So all that sort of background information to the case that helps us to understand what's going on here is also what makes it a qualitative study. But we then, within that case study, we're taking a deductive approach. And so we would then set out a set of findings that are guided by each of the research propositions. So just going back to this coding manual, for example, one of the research propositions was going to be related to personal role conflict and whether change champions experienced any personal role conflict or not. If we go back to our conceptual framework here, proposition 1 was about triggers. And so we might have a section on triggers and then talk about sparks, facilitators, and signals as 3 sub-themes under that particular theme or section, so having subsections of the 3 types of triggers. So that is what I'm referring to in this section of structuring the findings according to those propositions. So if I had 3 in the personal change, I would then be having those 3 sections of findings, 3 sets of propositions. With the role conflict, there were 5 types of conflict. Those 5 types would then be set out in my deductive research section. And then what the pattern matching is trying to do, as I mentioned, if there's different theories that are used, you're trying to see which of those theories provides the best pattern or explanation of the data. You would set that out one theory at a time initially, but then at some point you want to bring it all together and you want to look at how these theories could work together or which one better explains compared to the other. And you would at the same time acknowledge any conflicts or contradictions or tensions between the 2 theories. And I'll explain that a bit further shortly. So here's an example I want to take you through that's related to the process of pattern matching. So in this study, this student was looking at this process that was unfolding whereby leaders adopted certain approaches. So this is about their leadership style, if you like, looking at relational leadership and strategic leadership and drawing on certain components of relational and strategic leadership that were relevant for the study. And what the study is looking at is how leadership cultivates a certain culture in an organization, and it does so through various cultural mechanisms. And the work of Shine identifies, I think it's about 10 or 14 different mechanisms. And again, we selected 4 of those. What leaders pay attention to, measure, and control is the first. What systems and procedures they put in place, what stories they tell, what statements they make. So we're saying these are the mechanisms through which culture is being shaped, and the culture that was being shaped in this instance, or what leaders were trying to influence, was to create a culture of accountability. So that's what this study was investigating. So in reviewing the literature, we then recognize this complement maybe between relational leadership to create a culture of accountability and strategic leadership to create a culture of accountability, and recognizing they could complement each other quite well. Looking at certain mechanisms that might be relevant for each of these, and ultimately then creating this culture of accountability through these mechanisms. So within that, there's a whole lot of different research propositions that we're looking at in a case study with a handful of interviews being done. So remember the Smarty box that I was telling you about, right? You got a lot of data points you want to get data about, but from a very small sample. One thing we did learn from this study, and I'll show you that on the next slide. Sorry, not on the next slide, over here, is that if we start to map this out in terms of selected research propositions, this is just part of what I've showed you in that particular picture there, where we've got the 3 kinds of relational leadership, or 3 ways in which relational leaders display relational leadership: informal dialogues, formal dialogues, and trust building. We've got the strategic leadership, setting vision and purpose, building core competencies, and developing human capital. And now just looking at those mechanisms, you can see all the different lines connecting them, which is then what the literature would say, that relational leaders have informal dialogues where they then tell stories, which are the cultural mechanisms for creating a culture of accountability, for example, where leaders have informal dialogues, but that illustrates what they are paying attention to, what they're measuring and controlling. They happen to bump into someone and have a conversation with them because there's certain things that are important to them, that they're paying attention to, that they are trying to measure or control. That's why they have those dialogues. And so we could go through and explain each of these different arrows as the set of research propositions, and there's lots of them. And so one of the key lessons learned was rather keep it simpler than overcomplicate it with too many of these research propositions. And as I say, this is just a portion of the study that was done. And I'll come back to this diagram shortly. So we have this process of leaders cultivating a culture of accountability in the organization through cultural mechanisms, and those mechanisms are levered through the leadership approaches, relational and strategic leadership. How would we write up this case then? We would give the background to the case again, set in that context. This is a case study. It's about change in this particular organization. This is what's going on in this organization. This is why they want a culture of accountability. This is what it looks like. This is what accountability looks like, and so on. And so we develop this idea of accountability and provide the background to how that worked. Once we've done that, we then have a description of what changes were implemented by the leader. So this is, again, still a descriptive element in setting out the case, where we're saying leaders try to bring about change. They're trying to change the culture. What did they do? And then what does the culture look like and how did it shift? Would be, again, some of this background descriptive components of the study. We then get into the deductive thematic part, where we're starting to analyze the leader's behavior now. So there are often research objectives that are descriptive in nature, and so those would be addressed in these descriptive elements of the findings, and others which are more analytic in nature, and that's what we're focusing on here, where we have then a focus on relational leadership, a focus on strategic leadership, and so on. And so once again, we deal with each of those research propositions as relevant. And I indicated to you how we have this whole range of different research propositions we were investigating, maybe too many of them in this study, and so rather keep it simpler. But essentially, that same picture of the arrows here, I've just represented in a slightly different way. And what we have here then are these blocks that are colored in yellow, which represents the pattern that I'm trying to match. In other words, each of those amber or orange blocks represents a research proposition. So you might remember we spoke about informal dialogues in the form of stories. So that's why that particular block in the first row, the fourth one along, is in orange. It's representing that particular research proposition. So these are the orange blocks are the ones that we're actually trying to test. They represent our research propositions. And so you can think about these as different boxes that we're now gathering data about. And we're trying to see, is there enough evidence, going back to my court case example, is there enough evidence to conclude, for example, that leaders use informal dialogues in the form of stories or not when it comes to trying to change the culture? Is there evidence of them telling stories? How did those stories come about? Were they informal dialogues? Well, then it doesn't really apply here. If they wrote a story in a company newsletter, that's not really what we're talking about here. We're talking about dialogues, people talking to each other, and what stories they tell and what effect that has on the culture. Did they use those stories to build trust? So is there some intent in the story that's told or some evidence that the content of that story is related to trust and how to build trust? for example. And that trust is ultimately going to create a culture of accountability. So we can look at these cells in this table then as different boxes that we're trying to fill with data, and we're trying to see whether we've got data from the field work that we've done that matches the pattern that we anticipated from our literature review and the development of our conceptual framework. And this is why we would then be able to, in the end, reach a conclusion about, yes, we've got lots of supporting evidence of informal dialogues in the form of storytelling, or no, there's not much. And so we can see to what degree these apply or not. We might find there's just no evidence at all of any stories that were told, even though we asked about stories in our data. It was one of our questions we asked about stories. What stories did leaders tell? No, they didn't tell any stories. And we keep getting that all the time. Then we conclude we've got no data about that. We can't confirm this theoretical pattern in the data that we've collected. Okay, that's where I want to stop. I see there was one further comment. Okay, it was from Emmanuel. You were asking a bit of clarity, Emmanuel, about the idea of at what stage is concept maturity confirmed. I don't know if it, yeah. So Emmanuel, let me just go back to the slide that you would be referring to so we can talk to that as well. I was going to say, I don't know if it ever is, but probably at some point there would be enough evidence if we look at this idea, right? So this is about the maturation of a particular theory related to certain concepts. We first introduce the idea, we then start to build it out or augment it, and eventually that's established, and then it's about the consolidation or accommodation as it's referred to. And what I indicated is on the left-hand side, we've got this emphasis on more qualitative approaches to research, and to the right is the more quantitative. And I guess, Emmanuel, if we look at how theories should really develop, the quantitative is really more about theory testing, unless you're doing exploratory quantitative studies. And so I think the answer to your question would be how much research has been done, how much of the kind of framework that has been developed has been established or tested. In other words, what's the balance of evidence to say the studies have confirmed the hypotheses as we now move into this quantitative side? Or are there qualitative studies that are finding new things that are adding to and further developing this theory? And at some point, people are taking the theory as is. Then we're in the concept consolidation and accommodation stage. That is the given way of doing research until someone comes along and overthrows it. But we have this process of maturing. And if I use that analogy to people growing and developing, at what point we could say does a child become a teenager? At what point does it become an adult? And there's no clear that's the age. But on the other hand, we can see a development has occurred. Emmanuel, I don't know if you want to talk to me about that and see if there's anything further you want to add, or if I've explained it okay.
That's quite clear, Prof. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Okay. Yeah, so I think also, I mean, you talk about when it's appropriate, but I think people also have their preference for one approach or another. And that's fine too. I think there's probably very few researchers who would do mixed methods research or would combine quantitative and qualitative and do it well. And that's fine too. But I guess what I'm saying is you then have to say, well, this is my preference for the kind of research I'm doing. Therefore, I need to find the right kind of theory or level of maturity that applies to that particular, or that will apply that kind of research method. In other words, if you're wanting to do research on a new method, sorry, on a new concept, probably because you're in theory generation, quantitative methods would not work as well, right? That's essentially what we're saying. For theory testing, quantitative methods would work better. So if you're a quantitative researcher, if you like the statistical analyses, rather look for ideas and theories and conceptual frameworks that are well developed, and then test those and apply those. And look at ways maybe to add a little bit here or there to it, but you're looking at existing established work.
Thanks, Prof.
Thanks, Emmanuel. All right, can I just check if there's any further questions, comments anyone has? Manda, I see your comment there. Thanks for the appreciation. Anyone else? Martina, your hand's up. Please go ahead, unmute, and if you want to put your camera on, that'll be great as well, so I can see who I'm talking to.
Okay, no, I'm not going to put my camera on. Sorry, Prof. Just where I'm at, it's not appropriate. But
No problem. No, that's fine.
thanks. I just wanted to run a scenario past you. So I've got 4 research questions. For research question 1, I've got a framework that I'm testing, and I'm testing it. It's been applied to a number of different institutions, organizations in Europe and in the US and in Australia. It's never been tested in South Africa, and not on the case study that I'm using. So I'm looking at it both in terms of its usefulness, but also whether it's relevant to the South African context and this particular organization. Then, so that's research 1. So that helps me, and I've done the questionnaire. I'm in the data analysis phase now. So I'm very pleased to see I've ticked a lot of the boxes that you've suggested. But then research question 2 is more open-ended. It's about what are the implications for how this organization has performed against this framework for democracy. So that's more inductive, isn't it? Because that's not necessarily what the framework's trying to do, but it's more it's more on the open-ended side of the interviews. So it would look, so I was looking at Broad and Clark or another kind of thematic analysis. And then question 3 is really asked because my interviewees are experts in the field. So I thought, okay, let's see what they think about this particular framework. And I think pretty much all of them have said, no, it's very relevant. And then question 4 was, I'm going to refer it for future studies because I just didn't get there. It was just too much. But I mean, is it possible to mix?
We can talk through the first 3. Yeah. Okay. Sorry, I interrupted you. Continue, Martina. Is it possible to mix?
So is it possible to mix inductive and deductive according to the research question? Because I haven't really wrestled with the idea of propositions, but I suppose they're inferred in the framework itself. Then I imagine I would come out of it saying, this organization, if one uses this framework, has performed in this way and that way. This is what it teaches us. And yes, actually, the framework's quite useful. But maybe adapting it for South African conditions or whatever it is.
Okay. So can I just confirm you developed a framework from the literature and you then tested it out using a questionnaire? Was that a qualitative questionnaire or quantitative?
It's qualitative, and I'm using an existing framework. So there is a framework. It's been applied internationally by this writer, this researcher. It's pretty new, so it's only been around for the last. I mean, he only published his final. He published this in 2015. So I'm worried about the maturing idea, how you measure maturity, also because it has been applied to very serious organizations in the private sector, public sector, non-profit, but not in countries of the South. So that's where the limitations of his study are. So that's why I'm looking at it from a Southern perspective.
Yeah. So one of the articles that I've given my students as well is about gap spotting and problematization. And what it does is, especially for PhD candidates, it helps them to clarify what is that contribution they intend to make. And in gap spotting, they identify different kinds of gaps. And I want to just refer to that to talk about this idea of the maturation as well. They would say this is something which has been neglected. There just isn't much literature here. So you try and write up a review of the literature. There's not much that's been done there. Or you might find, so there's a gap of neglect. You might find alternatively that there's quite a lot of studies that have been done, and maybe whether it be quantitative or qualitative, but you often find there's contradictory conclusions or findings that are reached there. So that's a different kind of gap of confusion. And so you want to then do research that might help to sort out that confusion. And then the third is the kind of gap that you're referring to, where you say, this is something that's quite well established in one particular sector, country, area, region, whatever it might be. Does it apply elsewhere? And so you're doing a transfer to see whether it applies in another setting. So I think that's what you've done in your first part of your study. Then the question I have about your second and third questions are, when you developed or tested the framework in question 1, were you then in those same organizations asking at the same time about the implications? So are the implications further data collection, and was that concurrent data collection or sequential data collection?
It was concurrent.
Okay.
Yeah, it was concurrent. So all of it was concurrent. It was, so I used the framework, I framed the first.
Okay.
Yeah, and then.
Okay. So why I'm asking that question, that you actually did firstly collect data, is that I think in most research in your concluding chapter, you would be talking about implications. So even if you hadn't had that as one of your research questions, you would still often deal with research implications and recommendations as part of your conclusion to really say, now that we've got these results, this is what they could mean for practice, for example. But you've actually got data about that too, and now the question is how to analyze that data. You could then either still adopt the framework and do it deductively and see whether that applies if your framework is one about practice and application in organizations. But alternatively, as you mentioned, Braun and Clark, what their method does, they're quite practical in their approach, where they actually, if you look at the steps, they start to combine deductive and inductive processes. So that is their approach. So if that works for you as a different research objective, I would see nothing wrong with that. And especially if you really collected the data concurrently, you could then either say, well, there's parts of that I can approach deductively because I've got theory-driven codes, but there's other information that I didn't have as preconceptions in my literature, and they're telling me about those things, and so I can use data-driven coding and more of an inductive approach in combination with this deductive approach. I think Braun and Clark can help in doing that. And then the reason for doing the expert testing, that's different to the people in the organizations, is that correct?
No. So the 12 experts that I interviewed, I asked them what their feedback was on the use of this framework. So what I did with all 12, I prepared kind of an information sheet for them, which, if they had the time or could so choose, could delve into this theory. I mean, I was quite upfront and honest about this is what the framework that I'm using, and I'm testing it out. So they were, I mean, they're all published in their own rights, not all academics, but experts. However, experts, but involved in the organization from different angles, different stakeholders, quite a representative lot.
And different to the organizations that you are trying to draw implications for, right?
It's one organization that I'm looking at, and they all have particular relationship with this institute.
Yeah.
Okay,
Because I would imagine then, Martina, that in your expert testing of the framework, you could then probably apply the deductive approach, and pattern matching in particular would help you to reach a conclusion about the appropriateness or the level to which they thought that the framework worked for them as experts.
okay.
Yeah, so have a look at the journal article. I refer there more to the pattern matching, and there's other papers mentioned in there that you might look to, and they even get into some basic statistical analysis as well that can support that. So you might want to look into that as well with your sample of 12.
Thanks very much, Prof. That's very affirming. Thank you.
Pleasure. All the best with the rest of your study and write-up. Amanda, I see your question there, where you ask, is there room for iteration in both data collection and analysis as in the grounded theory approach? With the deductive approach, there would not be a iteration of the codes or a new coding memo, because it's based on a conceptual framework, right? And so that framework is going to be fairly static for your data collection process. However, I think it's always good maybe to collect some data, to analyze that data and see how it's developing. And then in terms of the pattern matching and the deductive thematic analysis, and then to collect more data and analyze that rather than getting all your data in at once and trying to analyze it, simply because I think doing qualitative research, there's still, even in interviews, it's a semi-structured interview, you might want to just refine some of your questions because they maybe are not quite getting to what you want, or there's certain things that might emerge, because what this approach does allow is for novel ideas to come to the fore because you happen to see them in the data. And so you are still open to new ideas. And if that's the case, you might want to follow up with other interviewees afterwards to see whether they can also confirm that novel data that you could then use to augment the existing framework. So yeah, I think that way of doing iterative processes would be right, but you're not doing an iteration like in grounded theory where you are maturing your own theory, because that's what grounded theory does. You're discovering and building a theory and doing a bit of verification of that theory. So it's not iterative in that way, though. Okay. And I saw the thumbs up, so thank you for that. Okay, we've got about 2 minutes to go. There might be time for one last question if anyone else has a question or would like to make a comment. I don't see any, so I'll close off the session then. Thanks very much for all of you who attended today. I hope it's been of some value to you. And yeah, have a look at those papers. Have a look at my Google profile. You'll see there's other studies that have been citing that as well. In other words, it's growing in adoption elsewhere. And you might then find people who have similar kind of studies or topics to yours that have used that, and it might be useful just to see what they've done as well. But yes, I hope this is something that's been of help to you as you either do your own research or supervise other people's research. Thanks, everyone. Isetu, you still with us? Hearing Isetu, but I'm going to
Yes, I'm
leave
still
now.
with you, Prof.
Okay, all right. So I think we're done. So over to you then, Isetu. Thank you. Thanks for hosting us today.
Thank you very much for facilitating this session. We can find the recording on YouTube.
Thank you. And then I will send you the presentation in the morning, and you can then circulate that to those who registered.
Okay, Prof, will do. Thank you very much.
Thank you. All right,
Thank
keep well,
you.
everyone. Have a good evening. Thanks, then.
Thank you.
Yeah, bye.